everyone to a video lecture on Heidegger on Cybernetics, Kybernetik. Heidegger speaks of cybernetics several times in the 1960s, and I will be considering mostly two texts for this one. First of all, the talk he gave, which is entitled Das Ende der Philosophie und die Aufgabe des Denkens, the end of philosophy and the task of thinking, and also his an excerpt or parts of his seminar on Heraclitus together with Eugen Fink. And before I begin, I'd like to mention that if you want to study Heidegger with me more directly, more closely, more intensely also, then please follow the link down below in the description so you can enroll in my Heidegger course. Before I begin with Heidegger, here's a quote from Norbert Wiener, one of the godfathers of cybernetics, which is apparently a positive feedback loop grid that wants to know no negativity of being, no concealments in existence, and that uses time and space as parameters. And it advocates, of course, for an interpretation and understanding of language as communication, as the transmitter of informational values. To Wiener, a proposition is, as a message, quote, a sequence of measurable events distributed in time, end of quote, where time, of course, is simply the linear sequence of points entirely divided from human beings. There is no inherent history in words. There are no ramifications. They are just signifiers, signs, computational values. All language must be formalized into computational values, hence. But what does cybernetics mean? It comes from the Greek. It means kybernetein, to steer. To steer, for example. The kybernator is the captain of a ship, for example. But there's also the steering, lest we forget, of the gods. There is not just the steering as the phenomenon of a captain steering a ship, which can be violent or not violent depending on the situation of the sea, of the weather, whether there's a tempest or not. And it has to do, of course, in a sense of steering with a certain sense of control, and also a necessary control in this sense of steering. A captain, and this is not just since the so-called mathematization and measurement of the world, as soon as the human being begins to steer ships, there must be some pre-calculation, some pre-rationalizing in order to steer and control the ship in such a way that we weather the storms, for example. So this is not to say that there's something, nefarious about cybernetics or so per se. But what Heidegger is telling us in the essay or the talk, The End of Philosophy, is that philosophy is coming to an end, and it's dissolving or beginning to bloom in, or beginning to come into effect, you could say, at least the Platonism of philosophy, in the sciences, in the natural sciences. And the natural sciences themselves, as Heidegger says in this talk, is cybernetics is the foundational science, the fundamental science that determines and steers all the sciences. A brief word, though, on the term "the end of philosophy." Heidegger does not merely mean that philosophy here demises or just comes to an abrupt end on a linear timeline. No, he does mean that philosophy comes into its place. And that's remarkable. I'm not going to go into this here. But think about it in this way, perhaps. Philosophy is finding, or is showing itself as what it was in a free following or free consequence, but still it's consequentially necessarily so that the sciences from which come from philosophy, as Descartes says, is that metaphysics is the roots of physics, which is the stem of the tree, and the branches are the other sciences. And this is what Heidegger takes very seriously. And it is also, Heidegger takes also very seriously that Hegel says that it is only with Descartes that philosophy finally finds a firm ground. And this firm ground is the human being qua subject, as the subjectum absolutum inconcussum, the absolutely indivisible, inseparable subject that is, in fact, and Heidegger understands this literally, that which underlies beings in their being, that which underlies the objectivity of objects is found in the subjectivity of subjects as the ground thanks to which beings appear in a certain light. And for this human subject, cybernetics is the steering mechanism. And this is sort of the first introduction. Why does Heidegger think that the sciences come from, that philosophy comes into fruition, as it were, in the sciences, but also at the same time, of course, loses itself? Insofar as philosophy deals with or asks for the being of beings, the beingness of beings. One example would be the genetic code, genetic information of the human being. That's the hypostasation, the reification of the human in the beingness of the genetic code, which can then be timelessly corroborated and manipulated at will, or so it seems. There is another hint I'd like to give in this essay on the end of philosophy. I will not go into clearing and the clearing for self-concealment, that's for another time. But it is here that Heidegger points out that all of philosophy is Platonism. Now it's important that he says Platonism and not Plato. But he does mention also Plato, and he says that with Nietzsche, so already beginning with Marx, Platonism is reversed. So Platonism being the textbook Platonism of a division between the visible and the supersensible or the invisible, the forms. But Heidegger also introduces in this text his phenomenological reading of Plato, where he says that what Plato was after, and this is what all of philosophy seems to be after, is the idea, eidos, not as invisible form, but as that which appears. So he seems to be saying that what cybernetics, which is the steering mechanism of the all-encompassing, all-consuming subject that deems itself the ground of what it means to be, that, in fact, what it deals with is mere appearances. Mere outer appearances and mere, well, let's say speculation, mirror play, and perhaps also phantasms and fancy. And also, just briefly to mention, in the artwork essay, Heidegger says that the groundlessness of the Occident begins when the Romans translate to hypokeimenon in the Greek as subjectum, without having made the same experience. So in language, again, language is here already not something that tries to safeguard a certain phenomenon that shows itself in and by itself, but is simply copied. So this is the first, if you like, simulacrum. So that the subjectum the Greek hypokeimenon is translated as subjectum. In this translation, because it is uprooted, it does not describe a genuine experience the Romans made, but they simply try to translate or to bring over a certain experience that was encapsulated in a word, which, however, they could not simply replicate, but they try to replicate. And that's when, as Heidegger says, the groundlessness begins. And perhaps this attempt to, in the fundamental, so even if cybernetics today isn't a great research program or anything like this, what is at the heart of biology, of genetics, of physics, etc., is the attempt to steer in a controlling manner and in a computational manner everything that is and that is supposed to be and that is not supposed to be. So I'll leave it at this for the end of philosophy essay on cybernetics. But however, Heidegger sees, maybe I should mention this, he sees the possibility and also therefore the necessity for another access to the world that would not come from out of cybernetics, not by going through it, and not by an epigonal renaissance of some philosophy or other, or some ism or other, some return to the new realism, which will probably be followed by a new skepticism very soon, I'm calling it now, or a new idealism, etc. No. But by thinking what has remained unthought and unheard, that is still open to be thought, in going back through the tradition from out of which cybernetics, as now the determination of beings in their beingness, insofar as this is what allows to steer and control them, there is something that has remained here, concealed, absconding, and withdrawing. And that possibility is there to found and ground another access to the world and phenomena, which is yonder of, outside of cybernetics. It is not exclusive, because history is not dialectical, but one of inherent turnings. I now turn to his seminar with Eugen Fink, and I want to go over a few passages. So this is Heidegger in dialogue with Eugen Fink, and they are discussing Heraclitus. They are discussing logos, tohen, the one, sophon, polemos, war. They are discussing the flash of Heraclitus, and they are not saying that they are all identical, but that they belong together. Fire, of course, as well. Pyr, the ever-living fire. Pyr aison. And they want to find not the identity between those, but how they belong together. And what's important is that they do, so fragment 41, if you want to read along in Heraclitus, they, Eugen, Fink and Heidegger, mention the Oiakizein, steuern in German, or steering, and they also address the dia, which is the dia, the prefix in dialectics, or dialogue, which does not mean to, but which means hindurch, through and towards. Heidegger points out, by the way, and this is, I think, important, that there are no opposites in Heraclitus, but that Heraclitus thinks together that which is at odds, striving apart. There is not yet dialectics, as Hegel blindly assumes about Heraclitus. Because there is not yet logic, and there is not yet the corroboration in logic. There is not yet the impasse of which Plato warns himself that dialectics is, and the danger of thought, of dialectics to thinking, because it introduces non-being into being and does not uphold the schism between being and non-being or nothingness. So, there seems to be a Steuern, a steering, as Eugen Fink points out, that goes together with the flesh, with the Lichtschein, the shining of the light of the flesh, which has the character of bringing forth and of movement in beings. And it concerns ta panta, everything that is. Let's just leave it at this. So it's not a steering of singular things, as Fink points out, but it is the steering of the totality of beings, of everything that is. The phenomenon of steering of a ship, Fink says, and I'm translating from the German, is only as an example that we can use to leap into something much higher and show something through this example of this phenomenon of a captain steering a ship, that the bringing to the fore of the flesh gives the drive to everything that is. And this is the steering of the flesh. So there seems to be, from very early on, and Heraclitus does not try to safeguard phenomena, he simply sees the phenomena. There's an immediate seeing, there's an immediate innocent, free seeing and noting down of an oiakitsei, of this steering of the flesh, of everything that is, insofar that it is. So, the question is, what is the dia? What is it that is how is everything moving through everything? So, why does Heraclitus speak of steering? And there seems to be a movement, a circular movement. There seems to be a circular movement, and then Fink says, through opposites. And Heidegger points out, but maybe there are no opposites, because we don't even consider yet, as I mentioned before, dialectics. Now, we don't have to worry too much about why Fink thinks that there might be opposites in Heraclitus or not. I think that I would follow Heidegger here. I would not assume that there are necessarily opposites, but that Heraclitus sees that there is, insofar as there is harmony, there must be what is bursting apart, coming together, striving away, striving inwards. So, what they are trying to get to, I think, is that there are different modes of steering. There can be violent steering, there can be willful steering, there can be a steering that is not violent, there can be one that is overly computational, rationalistic, technical, instrumental, instrumentalizing. But there can also be the steering of the gods. The steering of the flesh is certainly not the steering of cybernetics. At least not. That steering does not exhaust what steering can also mean. But we could say that, and Heidegger asks, who is or what is steering cybernetics? Right? It could be that the attempt to steer in cybernetics is actually derivative of, is a crippled mode, if you like, of this more primordial steering of the flesh that we are the suffering participants of, or receivers of, in fact, this lightning, of this thunderbolt, of this blitz. So, and Heidegger then mentions explicitly cybernetics. He says, the phenomenon of steering is especially today, in the age of cybernetics, has become so fundamental that the entirety of the natural sciences and the conduct of the human being is claimed by it and determined by it, so that it necessitates us to gain more clarity about it. So we need to understand cybernetics for that very reason, because there seems to be something steering the steering and steering the steerers. So they are trying to get closer to the phenomenon of steering. For Fink, Steuern ist das in die Gewalt bringen einer Bewegung. That means steering is the bringing into one's violence of a movement. If not, then we are, so his example again with the captain of a ship without the steering wheel and without any steering at all, it is completely at the mercy of waves and winds. So if we follow Fink here, then what this indicates is that cybernetics, as the foundational science of all the natural sciences, which also uses and abuses the categories of metaphysics to a certain degree, is an attempt by the human subject to steer and gain control over a tempest-ridden sea that it doesn't, or ocean that the human subject does not in fact fully control, but wants to, and it is through violence that it tries to do so. But then, however, Heidegger does mention that there might be a certain that there might be steering that is not violent, etc. And that maybe even the steering of cybernetics is not purely violent. However, what I think is important that we, again, as I mentioned before, Heidegger says that cybernetics itself might be steered. Especially when we think of something like sending or fate or destiny. What steers the steering? What steers cybernetics? So, and this steering, this sending, Heidegger suggests, might be one that is without violence. As, for example, the gods did send and steer in a certain way, without violence, at least the gods of philosophy, certainly not the gods of myth. We have to make a distinction here, I would say. And then something important happens. They move into genetics. And now this is becoming timelier, perhaps, than it was when they first had this discussion 60 years ago. Heidegger asks, in terms of genetics, Professor Fink, would you speak of a violent steering? Fink says one has to differentiate between the natural conduct of the genes and, of course, the manipulation that we now play with. And for Fink, this is clearly violence. Heidegger then says that geneticists speak of genes in terms of an alphabet, an archive of information. So we are, in our genetic code, in our beingness, an archive of information. In the black notebooks, Heidegger says, the modern human being is the victim of the filing cabinet. And we are perhaps today the victims of computer simulations and models that have nothing to do. So I want to be very clear that we should not conflate the rationality of old Europe and reason with the panic-ridden hyper-moralism of following the science and the models and these apocalyptic calculations of certain doom. We are becoming, in our beingness, to which we have been reduced, an archive of information. A data storage of genetic information. which of course can be manipulated and should be. Or shouldn't they? For example, to improve the human condition, to end suffering. It always comes with a moral voice, always. But it does go deeper. There is an attempt to steer and control what it means to be human through information theoretical interpretation of biology, biologos, of the logos of life, which is now reduced to the genetic code. And this is where this violent cybernetical impulse comes in. Because once the human being has been reduced to just the genetic code, of course it is assumed that by applying certain messaging software, shall we say, to certain systems within the biological makeup of the human being, that human being can be controlled. Of course this can be done for the sake of health and for the sake of the greater good of everyone involved. But it is an attempt, seemingly, of the willing subject to control. Seemingly, though. Because the subject itself is steered by something it does not see. Hence Heidegger speaks of the functionaries of technology. Heidegger ends this seminar by saying the following. That we must also, by the way, this is important, that we do understand that what information means. It does mean, of course, informare, as Fink points out, to press into a form. But also, messaging is the technique, the technique of the technology of messaging. Messaging something into a certain code that's already there. And this formalizes, as Heidegger points out, this cybernetic understanding of the logos of bios, the logos of life, biology. All of human conduct is formalized and reduced to cause and effect relationship. And it is here that Heidegger points out that philosophy truly has no idea what the sciences are doing. And perhaps those philosophers of science, especially today, have absolutely no idea what it is that the sciences are up to and what it or they or this entire project comes out of. What is it that they are doing? They are trying to steer into a flattened oneness, a total formalization of all manners and modes of being. However, only because the human subject itself is at a steering wheel it hasn't chosen for itself, and is at a steering wheel on a ship, on an ocean that it does not overlook. And it should be pointed out, perhaps again, that history is not dialectical, not one that moves in a thetical, antithetical, synthetical direction. That's not even Hegel, but just to point this out, but one of turnings. So it is not perhaps dialectical, but it is it's dia in the sense of moving through waves that come crashing. And in any given moment where something seems to be totalizing, that's when a breaking open becomes possible. Thank you very much indeed. So I said again, as I said in the beginning, if you'd like to study Heidegger more closely and more intensely with me, follow the link down below in my bio and enroll in my course. Thank you very much indeed.